Okay, welcome to Ideamarket Podcast. I'm here with Mike Elias, CEO of Ideamarket, and we are joined by Christian Kameir, the managing partner at the blockchain venture Sustany Capital. So, Christian, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So, as a way to avoid the typical "tell us about yourself" question, instead of telling us about yourself, if you were to design a course to transform people into yourself, what would that course look like, Christian?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I probably would give them my favorite book that I'm reading a few times a year. It's called Your Suspicious Mind. It's essentially a dumbed down version of critical thinking. So I try as much as I can to remind myself that the whole exercise of being alive is to just make better mistakes the next day. Right? I don't ever try to believe in anything. I try to have a thesis that's rooted in reality and that I can improve upon. And that's how I kind of approached my life since I was a little child. So that will be the book. Read the book a couple of times and that will give you a good idea of how I approach the topic of life.
So that course would be based around basically making mistakes. Do you see that as different from failure and failing?
Well, you want to make mistakes that are based on a thesis, right? So this way you got a learning experience. For me, the past has two objectives. One is you have pleasant memories. The other one is learning experiences. Other than that, I flush everything down like the proverbial toilet, which is funny enough. That's a term that Warren Buffett uses that I have been using since I was a little child, since I was 14 years old. It's like it's the toilet memory. There's only so many things that are worth remembering, and either they're worth remembering because it made you a better person or it reminded you not to do certain things, or it's just a pleasant memory you can go back to, but everything else is essentially clutter.
I'm interested in the idea of dumbing down critical thinking. I'm wondering if you could, give a dumbed down version of this dumbed down version. How do you dumb down critical thinking?
How do you dumb down critical thinking? Well, you want to start with the assumption that you're wrong. And then you want to find evidence for why you're wrong, right? And any given day. So that's the reason why whenever I actually publish stuff, the only reason why I publish it is not because I want people to like it. I want people to tell me where I'm wrong so I can make better mistakes tomorrow. That's the only reason. It's the only approach to that. That's why all of my articles, or where I can, have this disclaimer on the bottom. Hey, whatever you're reading right now, it might change if I can change it here. Because I have better insights in the meantime. So don't take it as the end all be all. And more importantly, that's how I kind of felt the first time when I kind of quote unquote discovered the World Wide Web, when it was still AOL and there was no Windows version of AOL, and there was just a basics version, like literally for basic of AOL. I thought, wow, that's cool. It's like we can all together make mistakes and revise them as we go along. So every time I go back to this, it's better than it was before. And that's the one thing that really, really has bothered me for a very long time about the web. Because if you think about it, when you search something, a lot of your searches, quote unquote, are really recollection, right? You can't really search for something you've never heard about, and you really, most of the time, recollect something. So to me, I thought this would be a utility where I can improve myself. So I search something, and next time I'll search it again. I find that plus something better, right? So as in, that's the way we're actually learning, right? You have a certain plateau that you're on, you have a certain vocabulary that you have. And based on that, you can have better experiences, better explanations, and usually you're going to be more successful in life as a consequence, albeit success is really kind of an externality of doing the right thing in a way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, Mike, were you going to say something?
Yeah, but I want to hear what you're going to say too.
I was just going to talk about moving to Sustany Capital, but
Sure.
What were you going to say, Mike?
I'll go first then, and then I want to hear about Sustany Capital, of course. When you're writing online for the purpose of discovering flaws and inviting people to help you improve your perspective on things, to what extent do you intentionally err or risk erring? Do you make your arguments like as tight as you can and then invite criticism, or do you say things that really might be kind of risky and flimsy? Like, where do you draw that line?
I'll give you my lawyer answer. It depends. I mean, the one line I think that's probably very provocative in our kind of field is the statement that I'm still not convinced that we need any cryptocurrencies whatsoever.
All right.
My thesis is that the number of cryptocurrencies might be that we need is somewhere between 0 and 1. And thus far, I haven't actually gotten like good feedback and data that convince me of the other side, right?
Now, when you say cryptocurrency, are you referring specifically to the currency use case, or do you mean blockchains as a whole?
No, I refer specifically to a new unit of account, because that's actually what's signaling it, right? Because, I mean, a token is really just a standardized smart contract. The coin is a standardized smart contract, but then it's the native version on a chain. But the larger point here is that it's software, right? So, and it's software that's built on open source, so it's going to change, right? So that's why there's to come up with standardizations around that is kind of a fool's errand in a way anyway. So this is the way we're using it today. And in terms of currencies, that's kind of a 1.5 hour talk I give. But to simplify that, the default medium of exchange has been bytes for decades. That's true for Bitcoin. That's true for Ether. That's true for the US dollar. That's true for the yen, right? So other discussions around that from a technology perspective are about the same as discussing what the colors of your bytes are. It's utterly irrelevant, right? And same with the unit of account, right? So the unit of account for Bitcoin is the US dollar if you look at your wallet. So that's another very provocative thing to say, and specifically if you're talking to a Bitcoin maxi who thinks that the unit of account will be lowercase b Bitcoin, the mining reward, which there is, in my mind, there has never been a thesis that would support that implementation, because usually it's not even a thesis in the sense that no one actually puts it in a way that you can falsify, because it's usually a half-complete sentence, as in blockchain or Bitcoin adoption, like for what use case by who, right? So it's a very nuanced answer. And to the extent that people need to live in the real world, unfortunately, the real world evolves around real world assets, and you cannot eat a virtual banana. So at some point in time, you have to interact with the real world. So the easiest thing in my mind is simply, let's observe what's true for the real world right now, and then let's make a line for the next 5-10 years. That's what we typically do, work backwards from there, and see, based on the current trajectory, where that line may take us, and then try to falsify that thesis. So to simplify this massively, the primary use cases of money, quote unquote, today is simply lending and spending, which the lending part being the much larger use case. The function, which is different, is simply that of language. So that's why I after having these discussions for more than a decade now, I came up with all this like very simple metaphors. Like if you stand with 3 people in front of a house, and the first person thinks the house is worth $1 million. The second person thinks the house is worth 1.25 million euros. The third person thinks this house is worth 20 million pesos. We're talking about the same real world asset. So it's just something that these individuals do in their head, which tells you that money is really just language. And I think I have lost my video feed, or is it just me?
Yeah, it does seem to have disappeared. There you go.
There I am. So I wonder if I need to shut down something here that's taking up bandwidth, although I'm not doing anything. All right. Anyway, so once you realize that, if you introduce a second person in that scenario, let's say the owner of the house, and this house happens to be in Tajikistan, which is a real country, and the owner wants tsunamis, which is the currency of Tajikistan, then the person that is interested in buying this house has to first agree with that owner of the house, what language of value do we want to speak? And maybe he agrees to the US dollar, and maybe he insists on wanting tsunamis. And then once you do that, you have to find the right medium of exchange that makes sense for the participants. So anyway, so the long story short is money is simply a contract, and is a multifaceted contract as soon as it is you interact with another person, right? And before that, it's just the language of value in your head, and it's rather arbitrary, and you choose it with either the technology that you're engaging with or via an agreement with the person that you're engaging with.
Okay, one thing I'd just add in there. I mean, in terms of cryptocurrencies, surely one of the key aspects is that we finally have an avoidance of the double spending problem. You know, these specific functions which are specific to blockchain technology. Are you saying that this isn't specific to the actual cryptocurrencies, that these can just be implemented on sort of a general financial level? We don't actually need Bitcoin and Ethereum to do this?
Well, what we don't need is the intermediary, right? Because in principle, this will facilitate peer-to-peer transactions. It's actually not quite as simple. And from a narrow technology perspective, it's actually not a peer-to-peer transaction, but also maybe one slight differentiation. So blockchain technology is really just a fancy encryption standard that existed a decade before Satoshi wrote the white paper. So he added the proof of work idea to this, which is even older, and that created the first blockchain.
So we've been talking a lot about metaphors. You mentioned how wallets are a bad metaphor for what cryptocurrencies actually do, how blockchain transactions actually work, for example. And my favorite example of a mismatched metaphor right now is the metaphor of facts in knowledge. It implies this sort of granular certainty that defies the basis of philosophy of science. All knowledge is tentative. It's something that evolves. We do our best, but it's always sort of limited and constrained by our knowledge at the time. And by basing our knowledge infrastructure off of fact checking, fact verification, we're kind of building in this lie of certainty into public discourse, and then using that to censor dissenting opinions and to enforce a perspective that people don't want to accept because they had no choice in it. They had no opportunity to express their own opinions and their own evidence and things like that. So this fact metaphor has two major problems. One, it doesn't really exist. We're kind of saying that certain things are close enough to consider unquestionable for now. And then that gap, that judgment call that someone makes, we're then trying to impose on everyone else. So it's impossible on the first leg and immoral to enforce on the second. Like the best case scenario, the best kinds of facts that we could possibly get would immediately lead to some form of censorship or impediment to free speech, free expression. And even if they're real, they won't land because people won't trust that sort of party that tries to impose facts in this way. So one of the reasons we built Ideamarket is because risk management is a much more well-tuned metaphor for knowledge management. That if you're familiar with Pascal's wager, the idea that, yeah, of course. So like Pascal's wager is Blaise Pascal's argument for believing in God, that if you're right and he's there, you go to heaven. And if you're if you believe in God and he's not there, nothing really happens. But if you don't believe in God and he's there, you go to hell. And if you don't believe in God and you're right, he's not there, then nothing happens. So from a risk management standpoint, it's lower risk and higher reward to believe in God. And all, reality has this built in. There's a mean to which markets revert. There's a mean to which reality reverts. Like the history of culture is sort of like a trading channel in that way, that we go through like these waves of denial and compensation and denial and compensation, and they kind of arrive at something until something breaks. So in any sense, I wanted to mention that and see what your thoughts are, and if there are any parallels in that come to mind.
Well, what comes to mind immediately is the stand-up comedian that I saw probably 20 years ago, because obviously people believe in very different gods, right? There's an excess of like 3,000 different deities that you could subscribe to. And then there's about the same variations within different belief systems. There's like a couple of hundred, and some people would argue a couple of thousand variations of Christianity that people subscribe to.
I did not mean to make a theological argument like the focus of this. I just like the inspiration. Yeah.
So this guy then started to sketch out how he was living out Pascal's wager in the context of there's potentially all these other gods out there. So he started rattling off all the things that he cannot eat, all the things that he cannot do, and how many times he has to pray. So needless to say, he had to forfeit a job, a girlfriend, and eating. That was kind of the synopsis, right? But then overall, so I don't use science ever as kind of a simple noun by itself. I just look at this from a schematics perspective, as in it's really the scientific method. And so the scientific method is just a tool set of certain procedures. So you put out a thesis, and your job as the quote unquote scientist is then to disprove the thesis, right? And so the opposite, and that's typically what happens, is people try to find proof for their thesis, because that's usually easier than the opposite in trying to disprove something. That's why there's good thesis, and like gravity is a really good thesis, because if you don't subscribe to it, you will have a rude awakening once you jump off a house and don't subscribe to that idea of gravity. And even though gravity was only proven in physics less than 20 years ago, I think it was like 14 years ago or something, I forgot. But it was really good, valuable thesis to hold for simple survival in general. And also at the same point in time, if your philosophy to, let's say, driving motor vehicle is Jesus takes the wheel, then we probably shouldn't allow you to drive the vehicle, right? Because you're a danger to yourself and others, right? So there's good theories to hold, and then there's theories that evolution will simply eradicate at the end of the day, right? So at some point in time, we stopped throwing virgins in a volcano to calm down the god that was living in that mountain, because we realized, there's such things as volcanoes, and there's no angry god in a mountain. And we stopped throwing fruit in the ocean because the belief in Poseidon kind of went away. So we stopped trying to calm him down while we were crossing the seas and so forth. So the point there being is that at the end of the day, reality has as a way of proving itself, right? By disproving anybody else who's trying to act against facts, act against reality. So that's why I always say my own whole objective is simply to make better mistakes tomorrow, right? So to add to my thesis, and mostly to subtract to my thesis, and then decide, okay, yeah, that was a thesis worth holding up until this point where I found counterfacts. And that's the only reason why you want to put out a thesis. So you don't want to necessarily defend the thesis. You kind of want to do the opposite. It's like, please disprove me. That's always my request. Please tell me that I'm wrong, and how am I wrong, right? So I can adjust my thinking, and accordingly then adjust my behavior. And I don't know, everybody actually does that, right? That's the reason why you can safely get out of bed in the morning because you use your feet and you assume that there's gravity. Right? So that's why this typical hierarchy of needs that people subscribe to is actually wrong. So you got this hierarchy of needs that you need food and shelter and all these things, right? So the actual primitive that goes on the bottom is certainty. What I mean by that is, so if you're sitting right now there in your chair and you want to get up, if you don't have certainty that the floor under you will hold you and you could fall through that floor, you're immobilized, right? So all of your energy is going to be spent figuring out how to survive, how to get out of that chair. And so this is a very trivial example, but this element of certainty is what people are looking for. So, and that's also then reverting back all the way to historical evidence. The reason why we come up with all these explanation is because people do not like uncertainty, right? So it keeps them up. They want an explanation what happens after you die, right? They want an explanation for everything. And the thing here is, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at this, this particular gene pool is always enforced. So if I'm in a Neanderthal, I'm walking through the prairies and I hear some rattling in the bushes and I think it's a saber-tooth that's about to eat me and I run away, then this gene pool gets to survive. It's the false positive that gets to survive. If I'm a Neanderthal, I hear rattling in the bush and I think it's just the wind and I walk at a leisurely pace and it was a saber-tooth, that gene pool doesn't get to survive. So that's why you're constantly reinforcing the false positive. That's why you're seeing figures in the clouds. It's overfitting, even though there is no bunny in the cloud. It's just cloud with a random pattern, or you see Jesus in a cheese sandwich and all these examples, right? This is just overfitting. It's this type of pattern recognition that has had a lot of utility throughout history. And it's reinforced in our lizard brain, right? We have this like old metaphor that now kind of has been disproven by neuroscience, that we have like a lizard brain living in a couple of other brains, right? But that is the root stem. That's really not true from a physiological perspective. That's more a metaphor, because your brain is actually very, very plastic. Has a lot of plasticity. Yeah. So if one part fails that currently is occupied with directing your visual system, you can actually train another part of your brain to take over these functions. Right? Anyway, long-winded answer of it's good to have a thesis and it's good to consistently try to disprove that thesis. That's a good approach to interact with reality, right? The opposite will always end up in a cul-de-sac, right? Because you can find proof for anything, obviously. You can find proof, and other people asserting that there's no such thing as anthropomorphic global climate change, that the world is flat, that vaccines are some evil plan by governments to make everybody sterile, or whatever other notion you want to subscribe to. You can easily find evidence to that, right?
Absolutely. And that brings up another key problem or challenge for the internet age. When we have all this information and we have social support, or the ability to get social support for any viewpoint, how do you create or reward honesty? How do you get people to pursue and prefer an improvement in their understanding over validating a preference or adhering to a social group or following a trend or something like that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, overall, I think we already see this is kind of organically happening, because if you subscribe to reality, you're usually better off at the end of the day, to simplify this massively. So you can measure these things on a country by country level. So in countries where they are very concerned with deities and spend a lot of time on that, you can see the relative poverty towards countries where people stopped believing in invisible friends in the sky a long time ago, and where this is basically not accepted behavior, right? So they will just prosper more. So that holds true on a nation state level, that holds true on an individual level, right? It comes back to I can believe all I want that Jesus takes the wheel, but if I actually act accordingly, that has negative consequences that you don't survive typically, right? So to that extent, I think it will eventually take care of itself. But the important part, I believe, is what we need to do more is just educate our youngest citizens in critical thinking, right? So that is not being taught today. So you need to learn actually, and you should never just be indoctrinated. That's what we're typically doing right now. So like in the US specifically, that was the hardest time for me to then honestly answer certain questions during the naturalization process, because I knew they wanted to hear things like Columbus discovered America, which no one in Europe thinks it's true. And I mean, it's kind of a running joke. So, and from that perspective, you just have to adapt at that particular moment to society. But then there's all these other people in the country who truly think this is true, and that's a historical fact, or facts like what are the reasons that we start wars, right? So when there's indisputable evidence that you can just measure, see, observe, and say, no, this was not the reason. Like this was definitely a made-up argument, and there were other reasons why we did this, right? So the point there being is, if you allow people to be indoctrinated, that's probably the only reason why you would still believe in something. Otherwise, I try as much as possible not to use the word at all. I will always just say my thesis is that if I eat X, Y, Z, I'm going to be better off than something else. And if you have good evidence to the contrary, please share that with me, right? And so at the end of the day, you're going to be more successful if you install these particular filters, because during any given day, you ignore 95% of the things that hit your senses out of necessity. Otherwise, you would go mad. But the way you're ignoring it is you're installing these filters. So that could be information. It could be just noise around you. You could be focusing on your heartbeat right now and so forth. So, and the point there being is how you process information is 100% depending on your filters that you install. So if your parents install this filter into you that your invisible friend doesn't want you to allow to say certain things, do certain things, you're going to start filtering it in this particular way. And that may or may not be helpful. Sometimes like it can be helpful regardless if it's nonsense, right? So you can decide, okay, I no longer want to eat meat, for example, because my invisible friend decides that's not the right thing to do. And accidentally, you're better off health-wise, right? But that's accidentally. That's not backed by reality. That just is a happenstance that coincides with that particular belief system.
Yeah. Well, the point about deities and religions have been used and abused both culturally in order to justify terrible things like wars and crusades and things like that. And they've also been abused on a local level for controlling people. They've been abused within a family for controlling people, controlling behavior, and justifying basic human types of irrational behaviors, just like anything else has. But I can attest, well, I've had many, including right now, actually, personal experiences of the divine in some form or another. And I would argue that even for atheists without the desire for or interest in that kind of thing, there is a particular, and you could even say secular benefit that God provides, the idea of God, of some higher power provides on a psychological basis. And that is, given our limited awareness of ourselves and our biases, pivoting, relying on or referring to some higher power gives an individual like a third party observer to oneself in a certain way. It gives a person leverage to sit back and say, maybe I don't know everything about myself. Maybe I don't know some things that I'm wrong about. Maybe I can't see my character flaws. And maybe if I can humble myself or ask for guidance, there will be some curiosity space that opens up that allows me to see that. So even without any particular belief in God, I think humans can gain a certain humility and intellectual honesty and psychological health just from the concept of a higher power, even without any of the other accoutrements and cultural effects of any various kinds. So I'm interested in that.
So I have a lot of problems with this term atheist. I think it's not needed. It's kind of like saying it's like I don't have anything against unicorns. I don't have anything against any other thing that people invent. So I'm not an e-unicornerist. I'm not an atheist. And to the extent that you want to use that term, well, then everybody's an atheist, right? Because most people believe in one God, but not in all the thousands of other gods on offer. So in respect to all of those, you're also an atheist, right? So you're always an atheist in that regard. So it's kind of a useless term in that sense. And so one of the things that I studied is neurolinguistic programming, and in that.
I saw that on your LinkedIn, and then we talked about natural language programming last time. I kept thinking I was getting the wrong one. That's NLP. I remember neurolinguistic.
Well, I studied both. So I studied natural language programming, and I studied neurolinguistic programming. So, but there's a lot of interesting exercises that you do depending on your teacher. But one of them is actually that you consciously pick these outside counsels. And there's no reason for you to limit yourself to just a made up person. You can just take a person or a number of people from history that you respect and who had great ideas and who are still revered today, and their books and ideas are still being followed, right? So in my case, I would pick someone like Christopher Hitchens and Einstein and Gandhi, and I would process things that I say through their lens, right? And they are then my counsel. So that to me is a more useful approach, right? Because these people collected a lot of wisdom that has been validated by other people throughout time that still hold truths today. So doing it this way is a little more deliberate than just creating like a vacuous idea of some spirit in the sky that may or may not frown about things, because you're more likely to then impose all the biases that you have been programmed with throughout all of your indoctrination by your environment, your parents and your teachers and so forth into that vague idea, rather than having a real person from history where you can simply pick up a book and read about the ideas that this particular individual had and that have been then picked up and expanded upon by other individuals, right? So it's the typical thing of we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. We all benefit today. The reason that you and I are alive right now and didn't perish at age 30, I think the average life expectancy for most of human existence was something around 34 years or something. So presumably all of us would be dead if there hadn't been scientific research and we proved things like germs and so forth, that we should just do simple things in everyday life to ensure that we don't perish at this particular, what we would now consider young age. And so ultimately it will always come back to what is the real scarcity? Well, the real scarcity is attention as measured in time. So, and that's ideally what you want to fight, because every other thing at that point doesn't matter. If you perish, it doesn't matter if you have $1 billion in your account. It doesn't matter if you have 10 oceanfront properties. You have no longer the opportunity to enjoy that. And maybe you subscribe to this idea that while you lived a good and redeemed for life, and this is why your invisible friend allows you entrance into this magical place that will grant you eternal happiness. Fine by me, but I think there's an outside chance that this is true, simply because no one ever came back from a near-death experience and kind of refuted his prior belief and said, well, I thought it was Jesus Christ, but I came back and now I think it's Buddha, it's Jehovah, it's something else, right? If someone had done that, it would give these ideas a little more credence. But to my knowledge, this has never happened. Right?
Yeah, I've never heard of anything like that either. One of our earlier guests, Vinay Gupta, has an idea that I like, which is when you have a spiritual experience or a near-death experience or something like that, you kind of interpret it through your present mythical framework. Like in a Jungian sense, we have like the collective unconscious, and we each sort of have a cultural or personal framework through which we just kind of naturally receive things. And when we're presented with this sort of other world beyond the veil, we see it as we are. There's a sort of intersubjectivity that's more sort of dreamlike than, well, actually, frankly, the physical world is super dreamlike. It's just more persistent and more like what do you call it? There's more like quantum consensus or something, but I'll talk about that later. But yeah, the idea is it doesn't necessarily force itself on you in the same way, but you see it through your own lens. So that makes sense that people would come back and not change their mind after, because they would have seen what they are prepared for in a certain respect. I love the idea of using historical figures and past wise people as lenses through which to view the world. I think that's I think that indicates a really profound way of addressing knowledge, not as like a pile of facts, but as a series of lenses that you can apply to interpret things. Because a lens won't remove anything or add anything to your environment. It will just sort of change the prioritization and change the meaning and relationships.
Yeah. And unfortunately, so we all have these pre-installed filters, right?
Yeah.
So that were installed at a time where we were still very vulnerable. What mom and dad told us was the gospel. And I had kind of either the misfortune or the good luck that this didn't happen to me, because I simply didn't have a father, and my mom didn't care. So I got to install all my own ideas, and most of them originally came from classical literature that was available to me. So I would read a book a day, and then eventually I got to this idea of, well, one book a day is really not enough. I need to read 2 or 3 books in parallel. So that's what I usually did on one particular topic. And if you go back in history, you will find that all these people that we revere, they typically had this multitude of interests. That's why I'm absolutely opposed against like creating these artificial disciplines, because we need to get rid of these as soon as possible. So there's no reason for any law school to exist anymore. And there's a lot of other things that we shouldn't be teaching, period, full stop. But the larger point there is, you need to kind of teach people to interact with reality that is tomorrow, not reality that was today, or that is today or was yesterday, right? And if you go into the academia today, and I have a lot of interaction with them, what they're teaching is the reality that we used to know 5 years ago. And that holds true specifically in this country for the medical profession. 10 years after they leave medical school, and 90% of what they think is state of the art or is true is actually false, has been disproven, because development in this space is now so rapid that, and you know this about our space, that it's super hard to keep up unless you educate yourself on at least monthly, but better weekly basis, right? And so learning is a continuous pursuit, right? So there hasn't been a day in my life where I didn't spend at least an hour, and typically 5, 6, 7, 8 learning something, right? And to me, it's a dire need. If I don't do this, it's like I can't sleep, and I have to consume more information and add to that, right? So, and but one actual good thing that I heard fairly recently, yet again, is you actually want to limit yourself probably to a subset of books that actually provide you with a useful framework rather than trying to add nuances on top of that, right? So it's better to embrace principles. So if you have a set of books of like 100, you want to reread those. So there's books that I reread every year, and some of them I reread several times a year, right? Because of that, because it's just like reinforcing this particular muscle, i.e. in critical thinking. I, like no one, like everybody else, I'm not immune to these fallacies. And once you get very simple example in literature that clarify, okay, this particular idea happens because you programmed yourself to believe this is true. So you need to re-question that. So that's what I do on a daily basis. And I tend to get more provocative over time, simply because some things I've thoroughly dismissed. And so that can be overwhelming to other people sometimes, because I will stand up and I have a lot of good ammunition that I collected over the years to a particular topic. So it's very hard then for a counterpart to defend that. And the other part is that a lot of people simply lack the language tools. So English is my third language. And I still feel after being here for 20 years that I talk like a child, right? Because I still think that there should be a more nuanced language. But for most people, their vocabulary is so poor that they actually can't defend certain ideas because they're simply missing the language. They will have very simple terms for the ideas that they can't differentiate, right? So that was something that occurred to me in that phone call earlier again. So people were using terms but didn't understand the nuances. And so specifically, we were talking about the development in technologies where you have a language, a real world semantic language discussion in English, and then you try to convert these concepts into software code. That is a very dangerous approach. If you don't understand things on a very simple semantic level, how can you translate those to meat space? It doesn't work, right? And that's unfortunately something where if you just out of high school start learning programming and maybe get a master's in CS or something like computer science or something, you typically miss out on those nuances that other disciplines, and hence my issue of disciplines, would have provided you, right? So I just naturally gravitated to a lot of different models of the world from a literature's perspective, right? Because that's one of my other kind of more useless degrees. In hindsight, it's kind of valuable in the sense of that it enables you storytelling and also enables you to think on multiple dimensions at the same point in time, right? Because there's very few things that are one-dimensional. Right? A lot of things are multidimensional, and if you're missing one of these dimensions, it's going to be hard for you to interact with reality, and it's going to be hard for you to provide solutions for meat space. Right?
One thing I want to bring in there, just as I mean, this is something that this problem of language is something I focused on in my my postgraduate work a lot. So I mean, in relation to epistemology and this problem of finding truth, right? If the more abstract the topic, the less able we are to communicate. So two mechanics from across the world, if they know the terms needed for, I don't know, a carburetor, a radiator, etc., they can communicate extremely efficiently to the point where you can get a car fixed. But as you move into more abstract topics such as religion, more subjective matters, the language barrier and the context is completely different. So just to take an example of what I sort of mean by this, and this is from a philosopher called Michel Serres, if we take the idea of love, right? Some people will take the idea of love and they'll analyze it via the language of science. They'll say, oh, it's a certain amount of chemicals, it's a certain amount of this, and this, just going on in your body, and that's all love is. But equally, we all hopefully would understand what it is to love someone is a completely different experience, and the two forms of language can't be conflated. They're not the same at all. And this is a huge problem with truth, because when we're speaking about God, often you're subsuming that experience into a language of, say, science, which isn't really compatible with it. It's a whole other thing. So, I mean, in terms of this, like attempting to find truth, what can the answer be with respect to language and all these different contexts to find a way to actually say, look, this is the truth outside of someone's personal subjective language?
Yeah, I mean, look at this in two ways. So if you're just by yourself and whatever you're thinking, whatever you're believing, and however you're acting on top of that is pretty irrelevant to anybody else, right? So it becomes relevant as soon as you engage with another person, right? So, and what's interesting there is my thesis there is if the two of us or any two people were sitting in the same little boat in the middle of the ocean, I think they would have a lot of agreements and very few disagreements, right? So they would have a lot of agreements towards, okay, we see land over there, let's row over here. And we have one bottle of water, I think we're going to share that until we reach land and so forth. So the point there being is the main problem that we have is that we don't have the shared reality anymore. Right, so that we kind of splintered reality in all these facets, and where we actually living all in the same reality. Like we're all breathing air, we all have to drink water, we all need to eat, we all want to be healthy, and so forth. So 99.9%, I think really that humans are in agreement, right? And you can figure this out by just putting them into a scenario where all these distractions that culture and societies impose on you are fading away, and all of a sudden you realize, yeah, you're a human being, I'm a human being, and if we have a monkey in the boat, he is pretty much the same as we are. So at that point in time, we can agree on pretty much everything. And if you want to spend your time praying to some deity once a day, so the other person probably doesn't mind, because the overall objective is simply to live another day and or not suffer, right? And if not suffering includes talking and praying to the deity, so be it, right? I wouldn't mind, and I assume most people wouldn't mind in this particular scenario. But once you introduce all these, let's call it distractions from your environment, it's pretty easy to then focus on the wrong thing rather than focus on the thing that unites us. So that is actually at the core of like this idea that I put out in terms of how we should fix information management, right? So to start with a principle that, hey, we should be living in a shared society. And I think we talked about this last time. When I was a child growing up, everybody around me, and specifically I remember my grandfather, he would always watch the same news as everybody else. There were 2.5 channels at the time on TV, and one channel at 8 o'clock had the news, and everybody watched this 10 minutes of national news and then 5 minutes of international news. And that was the shared reality. I know what's going on, and there was no agenda in the news. This was public television, so they just reported on the facts that happened. They didn't give it any color. There was no commentary. It was just simply the facts of the day that happened across the day. So there was shared reality. And now reality has been broken into a billion small pieces, and everybody can just bury themselves in that reality that's been created around them. And the unfortunate part is there's a lot of negative actors within that space. And some of them are intentionally negative, as in, hey, I don't want you to see things, right? There are certain nation states that you obviously know of that just don't want you to have certain information, because with that information, that particular nation state government thinks, okay, you might act out against our style of government, and you might realize that you're less free than other nations and so forth. So the point there being is, once you disseminate information, and I think I mentioned that, so we're working with this one NGO, all they're doing is translating information from English into that nation state's language. I won't mention it here. And then provide it in a form that's accessible to them, because that particular nation state is filtering reality for citizens within that state. So they keep them in this false narrative of this is the real world, when there's a lot of variations on the way that people live. And a lot of people, if they knew about it, would choose not to live in that nation state or not accept that particular reality on offer, right? So that's why I think that the most important task that we can do is break down these walls and get everybody to live in shared reality. And I'm just super mad about large scale companies that are filtering the web, for example, and then allow these narratives to exist and to be enforced. It's a crime against humanity. I can't think of anything more destructive that you could possibly do. I mean, it's the same thing that totalitarian governments do. And whatever the intention, and even if the intention is just that we provide certain information to increase shareholder value because our model is based on click-throughs and other KPIs to just keep you engaged as time on site and reaching time on site by polarizing the discussion, that should not be possible, right? That should not be a viable business model today, because the externalities that we're seeing, that we can measure, are horrendous. I think it's hard to see anything worse outside of like maybe polluting all natural water sources. But if you're polluting all information flow, right? So you're actually doing something way, way, way worse. And we're doing this at scale. And this has been obvious to me for more than a decade, so that there's still no large outcry. There's some outcry now, right? So we see government agencies discussing the behavior of certain for-profit organizations that have externalities for these governments, right? But what we don't really discuss is what externality does it have on humankind at large and on society at large. That is a secondary discussion. And that should be the primary discussion, right? So it's like the first thing should be like the same with the ethos in the medical profession. Your first objective is do no harm, right? And you are responsible for the information that you're putting out. You're responsible for the information that you're distributing. So that's why for me, the call to action for a long time has been, it's like, create these tools that measure these externalities and attribute them to the individuals and entities that facilitate that, right? So hold companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth responsible for the amplification of certain information, right? And not in kind of the censorship way, but in the sense of, okay, did you profit from that? And did you know that this had these particular externalities? And if you didn't know, was it willful ignorance, or is this just like benign negligence? But I think what we find is there's this typical threshold in the legal system if it's gross negligent. If you should have known that this externalities exist and you had the resources, you had the mechanics to measure these externalities, you're responsible, right? And so to me, it's very hard to find arguments against the fact that these companies that make billions of dollars on a monthly basis from these behaviors, that they don't have the means, the technologies, and the insights to not measure these externalities. That seems pretty absurd as a thesis of defense. Right? I don't buy that, and that no one is pointing this out, and by no one, I mean, let's call it regulators and tell them, okay, we do the opposite in this particular case because the responsibility is so large because you're dealing with the commons that you have to prove that these externalities that we can measure are not caused by you. Prove to us that you did everything in your power that these externalities do not happen, right? That people are not being misinformed, that people cannot find information to harm themselves, cannot find information that are factually untrue. And that is rather easy to do, in my opinion. Right? So if
part of the challenge, you mentioned the medical imperative of first do no harm. I think what you're describing also has a legal correlation in the idea that it's better that 10 falsehoods go free than one truth be suppressed. Would you say that kind of lines up? The part of the challenge with or maybe even the essence of the challenge with regulating the information that bodies like Twitter and Google and Facebook amplify or allow to spread is well, I just had it.
Well, I would simply, the mandate would not necessarily be to regulate, but the mandate would start simply with measuring, right? You want, because they measure everything else, think about it, right? So they measure click-through rates, they measure how certain colors affect people and so forth. So you should also measure these externalities. That's your job. Just like you have to measure the emissions of the cars that you produce, and if they don't fall under certain standards, well, you don't get to sell the car into our country because it pollutes too much. So I don't see this any different from the spread of information. If I can measure that the information has certain externalities, at that point in time, I can say, well, these externalities, let's discuss how we can mitigate this. Well, maybe we mitigate this by making sure that at the end of the day, we can attribute information to a particular source, and it can't be just an army of bots that amplify certain things because there's no one at the end of the day to hold accountable for. And that doesn't mean that there has to be like a first and a last name attached to any message, but what it means is that ultimately someone is responsible for that particular content, and you as the user of this commons, of the user of the information distribution system, should have the option to decide, well, if no one takes responsibility, if there's no attribution to a particular individual or entity for certain content, well, I don't want to even see it, right? Then just give me a button that says, well, if there's no attribution for this particular piece of information, I'm not interested in seeing it, right? So it's like the difference between having a textbook and you have references in the back and a fairy tale, which is just all made up stuff. You should have the choice. Okay, today I want to spend my time in fairy tale land, and tomorrow I want to just have fictions. And typically people are interested in reality, right? So if I quote unquote Google for what is the best XYZ toothpaste and so forth, there are certain criteria available to science, and at that point in time also to the person or the entity that's aggregating the information to create some objectivity, or at a minimum reference the particular sources, and then everything that doesn't have a reference because it's just advertising copy, it's just motivated information. Well, I want to be able to discard that, right? Because yes, if it's kind of a fashion statement, that's one thing. Okay, I can have very different opinions, but there's no opinions to be had from different people that think I can pray my particular disease away and I shouldn't do certain procedures because it violates my God. There is factual reality that has certain consequences, and they should not be able to amplify the opposite, quite frankly, right? So I don't see how that's justified.
The problem here is that you have to get everyone to agree upon the structure of what is factual, right? So I mean, I'll put my neck on the line, right? I'm not a flat earther, just put that out there. But if you are trying to prove factually, right, this is completely incorrect, you'll once again have to get them to agree to your own structure of proof. And what if someone just simply says, like, I just fully don't agree with the entire structure of how you say things are factual? Because I mean, the problem here is like an age-old philosophical problem of how do you actually prove something is entirely true?
And then how do you spread that? Tell me if I'm capturing what you're saying right, James, that like censorship is in a way embedded in the notion of facts. And if we're going to enforce facts or prevent misinformation, then we're going to have to censor. It's the same phenomenon.
Yeah, so it's a multi-tiered effort, as in, yes, you want to build your own, let's call it opinion. You want to build your own thesis on facts, but you also want to build your own thesis on the sources, right? So you want to be able to identify and say, okay, so this is the overall thesis, and these are the sources that support this, and these sources are also supported by other sources. And so that will allow you to make a better decision, because I don't think you see your hairdresser to ask her for a prescription on your cough or something, right? You seek out an expert, right? And to the extent that this is true for any information, you want to be able to attribute this to these particular sources. It's not about like censoring anything. It's about giving you all the tools to make an educated decision, and which includes the root of the information and how it was assembled and derived, right? So the typical example here is on NASA aggregates all the information on anthropomorphic global climate change, right? And so you will see this overwhelming support throughout scientific efforts that there's causality between human action and industrialization and the changing climate. And then you have like two dissents from that, right? So you got this overwhelming body, but then the way it's being presented is kind of that's on equal footing, right? So it's not on equal footing. It's like, well, we got an overwhelming scientific body that spent hours and years and decades and doing drillings in ice and proving chemically that certain things have changed over decades. And then you got these other people that simply say, no, climate is always changing, and there were ice ages and there were hotter times and so forth. So like, that's not the point, right? It's like, did you actually go through a certain effort to disprove your own thesis or not? Or is it just an opinion? If it's just an opinion, then I'm probably not as interested in your opinion than I am in the people that spend their life researching things and put capital and time on the line in order to disprove their own ideas, right? So that just has more merit. That's all, right? To me, it's always a matter of percentages. So I don't think there's any value even in talking about capital T truth at all. It's all whatever we know today. Today we know that the smallest thing that we can measure are, I think, quarks or something. I'm really bad in physics, actually. But before that, we thought it was atoms, and before that, we didn't know that atoms existed and so forth. And at the end of the day, these are all concepts anyway, right? So this is just our poor way of explaining things, right? I don't think that we are that evolved yet to even have an understanding. We don't know how most things in the universe actually work, right? Most things are still absolutely a mystery to us, which is fine, right? But you don't want to build your ideas on top of a mystery. You want to build your ideas on a thesis that you can disprove. So because it's like the typical idea of, if I want to get to Paris, right? The first thing that I need to do is not buy a plane ticket. The first thing I need to do is establish where I am. If I don't establish where I am, I have no idea how to get to Paris. It doesn't matter how hard you try, you won't get there. And so that's why most people already fall short. They don't establish where they are, right? And a lot of times it's actually a very easy exercise to do. It's like, where am I? As in, what are the things that I believe to be true today, and why do I believe those? And that's my starting point. And so we try this to do here with whatever technologies we're developing. We're simply trying to take a snapshot of what is today. Then maybe we'll go back in time to see a certain trajectory, and then we're trying to pull this forward 5-10 years from now. It's like, if we keep on this trajectory, where does it go, and how do certain things that are the polar opposite will change things? And those are the most interesting thesis to hold, right? So where these entire paradigm shift, but this nonlinear thinking is very much not part of human nature, right? So people think very much in linear fashion. People have a very hard time understanding exponentials, right? So it's the typical case where if you fold a newspaper 1,000 times, how high do you think it's going to be? Well, the answers will reach from here to the moon. But for most people, that's utterly counterintuitive, right? Because exponentials is not part of our thinking. We think very, very linear, and there's very few people can do this, and even fewer can do this persistently, right? Where they can see something as exponentially changing.
There's a good, you brought in the word disprove there, though, and that science basically should begin from the position of, here's our thesis, our task should be to disprove this. If we can't disprove this, then we've got a fact.
It's not a thesis.
Yeah.
If it's
But you also said that you respect people who've put capital behind things. One thing that's interesting here is it seems, and this is something that came up last time that you brought in, is that much of contemporary science is actually doing the opposite in that they have motivated reasoning. And that once there is a certain amount of capital behind things, same with corporations online, that actually opinion overrides fact, and they're no longer trying to disprove, but actually they're trying to prove. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what the data says, they'll find some way to eschew it.
Yeah, and that's an externality largely of capital formation as one part, right? Partially it's kind of what we call the publication bias, right? You're trying to find something, and if you don't find it, you try harder because you got a grant for that or something to that extent, or you spent the last 10 years of your life and of your company's money developing a certain drug or a certain tool. It's going to be very hard to just say, we tried this and there's no way it's ever going to work, but we'll have this particular outcome here, and this is what we end up selling, right? So there are certain things that don't work well in our idea of capital formation, right? And you see this in our broken sick care system, right? We don't have a healthcare system in the United States. I think that's undebatable. We're just treating the symptoms, but we're not actually doing the obvious thing, which is simply indoctrinating individuals, and they're specifically children, into the reality that certain behaviors lead to certain outcomes, right? So if I eat junk food every day of my life and I'm eventually obese and I have certain symptoms, that is not a mystery, right? That is a consequence of my lifestyle. And once you indoctrinate this and tell people, well, you're responsible, it's like there's no one else responsible, but that's your starting point, and you hold people accountable to that, right? So there's the things that you can't influence that are based on your genes and whatnot, and there's a lot of things that you can influence. And now the majority of people in the United States fall into the obesity spectrum. There's a tremendous amount of people that have diabetes because of their lifestyle, and society at large is carrying that. But also the other externality of that is these people are going to be less productive. These people will spend less time questioning certain ideas and so forth, because they simply don't have the energy, the mental resources to also contribute to these intellectual efforts at this point in time. And it's all interconnected, right? So it's a symbiosis of our society. It's a symbiosis of the system. So that's why, in my mind, the initial years of a child should be spent 100% on critical thinking and just making sure that they can be responsible for themselves as a starting point. And if and when and where that's no longer possible because the idea of work is changing and whatever, then as a society we need to step in. But this needs to be our starting point, right? In order for us to survive as a species, because what we're doing right now is kind of this idea that I call learned helplessness, right? So where a lot of people will just capitulate and don't think that they have any power over their life in a lot of areas of daily living, where they think, well, I just can't eat junk food and I just have to take this particular medication. And once you realize, no, 90% of your outcomes will always depend on you, and probably more like 99%. Right? But again, it all starts in your early childhood and with these filters. Right? And unfortunately, instead of giving people the tools, what we do is we indoctrinate them in certain ideas. So I'm a big proponent of just penalizing these obvious outcomes, as in, let's make everything that is beneficiary for human well-being tax-free, and let's tax everything that's we're already doing this to some extent, right? So we're taxing tobacco, we're taxing alcohol, we're taxing gasoline, and there's horrendous tax on all of those. But then we're doing other nonsense that we're taxing income. So we're taxing productivity. That's obviously nonsensical, right? And then overall, what we need to come to grips with is that the current state that people accepted as being the truth, that you have to have a job and work from 9 to 5, for example, that is a fleeting moment in time, right? So for most part of human history, that obviously hasn't been true. And you already see this disintegrating right now on a daily basis, right? And I think the vast majority of the population hasn't realized that yet, right? So that what we call today the gig economy, that's actually the real economy, right? So whatever actually adds to productivity, this will be the norm for most sectors of economic productive activity, right? That's not the exception, right? So right now, a lot of people think this is the exception and maybe even like a fleeting thing, but that's utterly not true, because that used to be the norm, right? So before we started industrialization, before we ever came up with this idea of factory work and division of labor and so forth, division of labor ultimately will mostly be done by quote unquote machines, right? So everything that you can divide into smaller and smaller tasks and decentralize and ultimately automate, it will ultimately be automated, right? Like now, I mean, you probably saw that in Japan, they have fully automated dentists. It's a complete robot. You just sit down and it's a dentist robot. Right? But we see on a daily basis, like the things that we are looking in technology investing, there's ideas that are taking hold now that will displace entire disciplines. That's why I said we need to close all law schools. Now there's no reason for them to exist. We need to create entirely different disciplines that actually cater to the reality of today and the future that we see clearly before us, right? So our task as VCs here is to basically foretell the future within our little niche, and our little niche just happens to address all of economic activity, right? So all the fundamentals of economic activity that we focus on. So that's why by default we take on a global perspective, right? So these have to work globally, and they have to be accessible to every single person. So which comes back to that earlier point of information. So the threshold for anything that we call information technologies has to be, can it be used by an individual that lives in a circumstance where his particular environment, i.e. his government, doesn't want him to have this particular piece of information. So if your technology facilitates that, and information can be value, right? So most of digital entries signify value entries, right? So it could be valued in dollars, could be valued in bitcoins, but it's information. It's information of value. So if that person that is living under these constraints is unable to use Bitcoin, is unable to use Ether, is unable to use certain identity protocols, is unable to access certain information, then this particular technology is not suitable for anybody. Right? So that's my threshold for technology. And so that's where I kind of draw this binary line. So I have a huge list of like business models and technologies that in my mind are not viable, right? Because they put humans into a position where they're oracle functions of the network rather than agents within the network. They're no longer the endpoints. And right now we are not the endpoints, right? So we are simply pawns where the network observes our behavior, stores the data, distributes the data, copies the data, and then spits back a response. And that response is based on the interest of a second entity that's not us. So it's never based on what we are trying to achieve, either intentionally or emotionally or for any other motivation. So whenever you interact with technology and information technology in particular, you're typically not the agent, right? Unless it's something entirely mechanical, right? As soon as you're dealing with quote unquote data, you're right now in a way the victim, right? So you're the one that's being manipulated into only seeing certain things, and then based on these certain things being driven down, typically a particular chain of actions, right? Click on this, click on this, click on this. Oh, this is how you derive there. And to me, that has always been observed from day one. The first time I did a search for, I want the best healthcare plan, and all I saw was advertising copy, and you could click 10 pages down and still only advertising copy. There's no information that is being generated or made visible, for that matter, by someone or an entity that actually just collects the information for the purpose of providing this particular answer, what is actually best by these particular criteria. That still doesn't exist. So as far as I'm concerned, we should have many, many, many search engines, right? Search engines for healthcare, search engines for law, search engines for nutrition, search engines for everything. And the motivated reasoning should not occur, right? So it should always be based on references, and it should always be peer reviewed. And it's mind-boggling that this is not happening, because it seems like such an obvious thing to do.
I love that vision of the attribution of sources and the chains all the way down, and being able to see how the network channels you into various paths. And I agree that that's something to replace with something where the humans are the agents and we have more control and insight into things. But motivated reasoning has as ancient psychological roots as anything else that we face. It doesn't seem like something that's just going to be eradicated, but something that somehow we have to live with or corral into something more productive, so that when we're always going to be motivated to reason in a certain way. David Hume, for example, says reason is a slave of the passions. I want to kill this guy, and then I come with 500 reasons why it's justified. That's, the conclusion, it tends to be predetermined. And especially, this is no less true for the super educated, because this is an emotional issue.
Especially, actually, funny enough.
Yeah, right. So there's not really an escape. There's not really a population to whom this does not apply. So just, setting people aside and making them philosopher kings isn't going to work. Setting scientists aside and making them decide everything isn't going to work. Yeah. Leaving it to the public by itself isn't going to work. There has to be some sort of way to take the motivation that's already going to be behind reasoning and make it useful, make it less of an inhibition between us and reality.
Well, I think that's it solves itself, as in, if you make decisions on reality, long term you will just have better outcomes.
Yeah.
Right? So in terms of, if you make financial decisions that are based on your belief that XYZ will go up, that usually doesn't happen this way, right? So that there's facts and reality that contribute to this particular movement, but you always want to go back to first principles, right? So, and I do this on a daily basis with projects that pitch us. And so what's very important to me is then just to see what are the principles that you applied. So I just had this discussion again this morning. People take this big set of solutions and they don't ever look behind it and see, okay, why does this solution exist? And so the two examples that I have been discussing ad nauseum is like these topics of know your customer, which doesn't exist, by the way. It's just a made-up term. It's much more nuanced. And then the other ideas are all around this topic of identity, right? So this morning I have this paper here that's like from a very large company, right, that has come up with these ideas on how you should do quote-unquote identity management. And I think we talked about this before. This is a nonsense term. But more importantly, if you start out with a definition of that and then you build your technology on top of this, like ostensibly wrong definition that doesn't relate to reality, that doesn't actually influence meat space in any shape or form, right? At that point in time, your solution that you're building on top of that is most likely not going to be viable, right? It's like saying, well, water is not wet. That's my assumption, right? So I'm making the assumption that the identity is X. And if that's not actually the problem that you're solving, then everything else is mute. It's like the typical thing in our space here is the whole idea that people keep focusing on banks as being the problem. I agree that banks are a problem. Overall, we don't need any commercial banks from a technology perspective. But the thing to focus on is what problems do banks solve right now, because they're being used by people. So what is the problem that the banks are solving? Then solve the problem better. Meaning, don't solve for the bank, solve for the actual problem that people are having. That's why all these discussions around these new ideas of central bank digital currencies are emblematic for this non-principled thinking, because they keep discussing things like cross-border payments and payment functions and so forth. None of us has problems with paying, right? The payment is a solved problem for all intents and purposes. What is the problem that people have with fiat currencies? The main problem that people have with fiat currencies is it's a loss in purchasing power. So that's the problem you want to solve for. But obviously, if you're the one that's issuing these inflationary currencies, you're not going to see this as a problem, right? So you're not going to solve for that, right? So someone else will solve for that. And we're already seeing that. That's why the first thing that I always tell people in a lot of these discussions around CBDCs is, you're not talking about the actual problem. There's no value in us having a discussion with you, because the problem of payments is a non-problem for me and for most people around me. There are 15,000 ways of solving that. And even though from a technical perspective, fiat never settles, from the consumer's perspective, it settles instantly. I swipe my credit card, I swipe my debit card, and as far as I'm concerned, it's settled, right? So I'm moving on with my life. I don't think about the fact that there's 15 different legal agreements. I just entered into a new one. That doesn't really matter for my life, right? So the ability to take a step back and analyze the real problem and then actually formulate a problem statement is entirely absent from government, right? You don't ever see that. They never take this first principle stand, because it comes back to the other topic we were just talking about, healthcare. It's like, what is the actual problem, right? What is the systemic, obviously measurable problem, right? So how do we address that? And so maybe we address that with information campaigns, and maybe the information is specifically targeted to a certain age group of people that are very much influenced by these other information advertising that entices them to drink sugary water and eat fried food and so forth. So maybe we should penalize that behavior because it has certain outcomes. But the point being is, you just want to take a snapshot and say, okay, from first principles, why do we have these outcomes? So this is the state of the nation, right? So the state of the nation is not the typical thing that the president says, where everything is hunky-dory. The state of the nation is most people are sick to some extent. A lot of people have an addiction to something. A lot of people spend a lot of their time just browsing the internet, looking at nonsense, and that has a certain root cause and it has a certain externality, and so forth and so forth. These are all measurable things, right? So it's not like these are mysteries. These are all very much things that are accessible to objective reality, can be measured, and you can draw straight lines from particular behaviors to particular outcomes, right? So I'm consistently dismayed when I enter these discussions and then they don't want to talk about the actual problem. Right? That happens consistently, right? Ever since I turned 50, I have no more patience for that. It's like I will just call it as I see. It's like, you're not talking about anything relevant. Let's talk about what's actually relevant, because if we keep talking about that, nothing's going to change. Whatever you're spending your time on is going to be a waste of your time. It's like, go back to the basics. I don't care if you spent the last 30 years of your life in banking. I don't care if you spent the last 30 years of your life researching this one particular problem in science and nutrition. It's like, just measure what we have right now. That's your starting point every single day. Don't argue against observable reality, right? And yeah, anyway, so larger point there being is that should be our basis for any discussion that we're having, right? And that's not happening. We need kind of the B-roll of reality in Congress that first says, well, this is observable reality. This is how many people are sick right now, and we can chart this back to these particular behavior, and this particular behavior is facilitated by this particular messaging. So let's do something about the messaging, which at the end of the day is the root cause, right? So to me, it's like advertising doesn't even have to exist. Why should it exist, right? So, specifically, maybe it's okay if it exists for fashion and other things that are kind of extra and voluntary and a statement of my personality. But in terms of things that we consume, in terms of things that are objectively harmful and measurably harmful, so that should not be something that should be promoted without a penalty, right? And without accountability. Why should that happen? As I said, I mean, we're already mitigating against in some areas. Why aren't we mitigating against that in all areas? Right?
Yeah, I think the sort of archaic incentive systems that we're building all this modern infrastructure on is the only reason I can imagine why there's such this giant mismatch between the way politicians and regulators are supposed to serve the public and how distant they are from achieving that stated goal, that explicit goal. Another example of what you're describing with the obvious behaviors leading to the obvious results is if you go into most restaurants and buy a drink, they have the little machines that have 8 options. Well, 7 of them are basically sugar and syrup of some kind. And that's usually the least expensive thing. So anyone who's in a position of poverty will have a far easier time surviving by making themselves worse health. It's sort of like a debt. It's like a health debt. People go into debt to pay their bills. People go into health debt to stay alive if they're poor. And this sort of debt is pervasive in kind of every single industry or area of life. And there has to be some kind of fundamental incentive restructuring for that to change, because while that's still the case, politicians are still going to be oriented to their goals. Get, vote debt, get confidence debt, make deal debt, get, corruption debt. That the same sort of failure mode is built into the whole system, and it's at the point where the flaws in the metaphor are outweighing the benefits that it was instituted with in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I think the good news here is that we start to decentralize all of these information systems, right? So that you're less and less will be forced into just doing consumption in a very particular way. You will be less and less forced to buy into false narratives, into like the fiat systems overall. And I'm not limiting that necessarily to fiat currencies, but anything that by decree governments around the world put forth as an idea of living, right? So the thing is, all these alternatives have been available to everybody at all times. It's just they weren't really made popular and weren't really made visible, right? So the typical examples would be international corporations that pay no tax, right? So everybody complains about that, but it's like a great example of how everybody should be living, right? So you should always do this type of arbitrage where government should provide you with a service, right? And if you don't like their particular service or you think it's overpriced, then you should be able to get a different one, right? You should have choices in that regards, and governmental systems and fiat and so forth should be competing for that, right? Money should have always been competing for being available at scale to anybody on the planet. If I want to live my life in a different quote unquote fiat currency, that should be simply possible, right? As a matter of fact, because to me, like my self-expression, my language and so forth is actually superseded by the way that I allocate capital. Right? So the way I want to express myself in commerce is as much protected by free speech as the things that are coming out of my mouth and the things that I'm publishing. Right? So it should have the exact same protection, and we should have the enablement to allow anybody to express themselves in this particular way. So if I tomorrow start wanting to express myself in British pound sterling or in Bitcoin, so forth, that the government should not be able to do anything about this. To the contrary, it should enable that. Right? It's the responsibility of the government to protect freedom, right? Not to encroach on it. Right? And part of living in a free society is that you can say what you want up to the limit where it's harming other people, and that you can do what you want up to the level that it's harming other people. And you choosing to express yourself in another currency is not harming anybody but government. But, well, government should be working for you, not the other way around, right? So it's a function of society. It's not an entity. So that's one of the usual fallacies in speech that people typically do. They say government does X, Y, Z. No, government doesn't do anything, right? So it's people that are employed by government agencies and the interests that standing behind them that initiate and do something, right? So governments are simply functions. They're functions of society. So once you embrace that notion and you find yourself in a position where you think these are government services and I can decide I want to use this government service or I want to pick a different government for this particular service, i.e. healthcare. It's like I don't like the healthcare here. It's like I want to subscribe to that of Singapore, and I want to subscribe to the service providers in the United States that subscribe to that same idea where this is privately organized, regulated, and everybody somehow seems to be healthier because of that, right? So the point here being is we have all these working models. So we can look around the world and see what models lead towards human flourishing, and we can see the models that definitely don't lead to human flourishing. Like, I think we'll have a hard time finding anybody who wants to live in North Korea, and you'll have a hard time getting people convinced that live here right now to move to China and subscribe to the idea that all of your financial movements and your personal movements should be monitored and sanctioned if and when and where it doesn't comply with what the quote-unquote government thinks is the right way of living, right? So and the point there being is we kind of make that concession and say, well, they're doing something wrong, as in they're disappearing their billionaires and they're eroding the capital accumulation by large companies because they are stepping into private commerce and so forth. But the thing is, every government is doing this to some extent, right? So, and you should be the one, meaning the individual should be the one that can pick and choose and say, well, this is an extent I don't like, and this shouldn't have to translate into I have to physically move my body, right? So, because most things that you do now, they don't require you to be at a certain place, right? We're both living in California. We both choose to be here, and we're paying the price for that, right? So we're paying this enormous toll that people in Nevada don't have to pay, right? So, but we made this particular choice. The question is, and now fewer and fewer people make that choice because the trade-off is just too big to them. But it's a choice that they should have to make, right? They should say, well, I declare that I'm now a citizen of Nevada. I'm still going to live here, but I subscribe to this idea of governance, right? And governance is a service, right? It's a service to me. And let's just vote on that. And I shouldn't have to vote by actually physically going there. Right? That's a different type of vote. And yeah, that is utterly bizarre to me. And there specifically the whole notion of capital distribution by government force, that is an absurd idea, right? So it's destructive on so many levels. The capital allocation that I would have done myself would always been more charitable and more efficient than whatever government entity could ever assume. And plus, simply by doing the redistribution, they're destroying anywhere between 10 and 15% of that actual productive behavior, let alone the externalities of having to maintain all these oversight mechanisms, right? There is no reason for internal revenue services to exist at all, right? So these ideas of flat tax have been made since the 80s and are utterly sound, right? So it's utterly obvious that the way it should be done is that we should simply tax consumption. And the thing is, but instead we made up this kind of cumbersome bulwark of nonsense taxation systems, i.e., people say there's business tax, for example, right? There is no such thing. That's nonsense. Because so if a business has to pay XYZ sales tax or something like that, they're just tagging it on and you see it on your receipt. So it's not business tax. They're double taxing your income that's already has been taxed, right? So on top of that, as an externality, now they're making the business a tax collector. So it is wrong on so many levels. And simply from a utilitarian perspective, if you think about this, we could get rid of this today and spare all these people from do all these nonsensical jobs that don't make anybody's life better. It's like, I don't think there's a whole lot of people that were born and at 12 years old, they decided, I want to be an accountant, mommy, or I want to be a forensic auditor or something. Like, I don't think people aspire to do that, right? These are kind of these artificial functions that we created by government overhead and these misguided ideas that we should do wealth distribution through a mechanism we call governance. Right? That is utterly absurd on face value. And we have seen this throughout history. It's not like we have to make this up from the current state. We can see throughout history, wherever like more than half of the population is assigned to do non-productive activities, eventually the system will collapse. And we're pretty close to that, right? So when most people don't do anything that's actually resulting in product or a service that serves someone else, but is simply for the measure of redistribution. And it's unhealthy for that person, it's unhealthy for society. And it's mind-boggling to me that we still have that, right?
Yeah.
Because it's bizarre.
You must, there's this brand new phenomenon of play to earn games, blockchain-based games that pay you for playing them.
Sure.
And that just seems like kind of a black hole of effort. Like if you're getting paid, there's no reason to stop, and then there's no product that comes out of it. Does that fall into this category of unproductive labor? Is it worse? Is this in the same sort of category that you were just describing?
Yes and no. So I'm a big proponent of like games as far as they actually simulate real world economic activity, i.e. what we see at scale in DeFi right now. It's basically a multi-massive online player game because it's only concerned with digital native assets. But since it's at a certain scale, you can now measure what it would do in real world economic activity. So it's a good testing and proving ground. Obviously, that's what we do throughout growing up, right? So we're playing, but we're always kind of simulating reality. So to the extent it does that, I think it's somewhat productive. To the extent, obviously, that this is your entire life, that's somewhat questionable. But then again, if it makes you happy, who am I to judge, right? So I personally haven't played many games since I was 12, really, but and whenever I start one, after about 90 seconds, I find myself that to be not interested, not intellectually engaged. So I move to something else, and I also feel guilty for like wasting my time. I think there's so many more pressing issues. but yet again, it's there's probably more value in that particular activity and stress testing these systems than anybody who is filing right now some tax return or doing some paper audit or writing some Sarbanes-Oxley report or creating some privacy policy that no one reads or whatever it is. So there's many more activities that I would penalize before that, right?
Yeah. There are at least two things I want to mention before 11. I know you have a hard stop. One is, earlier you mentioned attention as measured by time as being the most important metric?
Yeah, attention as measured by time. That's I mean, there's, you probably know the various science fiction novels that were based on that, and some movies that were based on that.
Right.
So that's our ultimate currency at the end of the day. Attention as measured in time.
So how do we? I wanted to follow up on that and ask you specifically, how do you get the best ROI for your attention?
Oh, wow. So that's a very layered answer. So attention is obviously also influenced by your physical state, right? If I wake up early and I'm drowsy and I try to be creative, that's going to be difficult, right? So you want to assign certain tasks that you're trying to accomplish at the peak of your physical capability, of your capability to focus and concentrate, and you ideally want to calibrate and measure this particular behavior and then organize your daily activity into these buckets so that you have a certain cadence. So I get up every day at the same point in time. I had an ever-expanding supplement regime for decades, and that allows me to be at a certain level of energy throughout about 18 hours of the day and be productive. And intermittently, there's these sequences where I realize, okay, I'm no longer productive, and at that point in time, I do something that's just busy work, right? So I'll organize my office or something to that extent. But like the ultimate utility, you should just start out every morning just making a list what you're trying to accomplish, and you should start out every month with what you're trying to accomplish that month. You should start every year with what you would try to accomplish every year, right? And I've been doing this for a long time. So when I was, I think, 27, that occurred to me first. I spent a year of my life, no, not a year, but probably a better part of a year of my early 20s just finding a reason to actually engage with society at all and simply honestly not kill myself, because I was just dismayed with the state of humanity at that stage of my life. And eventually I came to the conclusion, okay, let's just keep busy. And so I wrote down a list, an ever-expanding list at the time, that I kept in a spreadsheet where I just set forth goals and I put down timelines. And that's the reason why I'm A, alive, and that's the reason why I'm B, here, right? So I wrote down 287 things, and then I accomplished 200 some of those within a matter of a decade, right? And some of these things were absurd, and some of these things, looking back, were childish, and a lot of these things had simply to do with wanting to achieve certain material states and so forth. And then eventually you'll have setbacks, and you recalibrate, and you realize, I don't need to have a sports car and another car and a house on a golf course and all these other things, because turns out I can also live in a shack in the woods and be at the same state of happiness, just being productive by writing. And that's how I fill my time. But yeah, so you want to have goals that are worthwhile at the end of the day, right? And whatever is worthwhile to you might not be worthwhile to me, and vice versa. My ultimate objective, being very much utilitarian, if any label would be useful, is simply that my starting point is how can I ensure that information flows in a way that we're solving things that affect me and everybody else, i.e., how do we solve aging? Right. So, and what can I contribute with my resources in order to make that happen? Right. Because for the longest time, we accepted this idea that you have to die. Right. And I don't accept that idea. we proved in the 40s that aging is a disease, right? We can't keep cells alive in a petri dish forever. And now there's actually a larger body of work behind that, entire life extension centers behind that. But the thing is, it's common sense that this is true, right? Because we have cells, some people have certain cells that live forever. Unfortunately, these are cancer cells, but they provide the clue for that this is possible. So that's the ultimate scarcity. So when we fix that, then how do we fix the next ultimate scarcity, right? So how does everybody have access to clean water every day, right? That is such a crime if you think about it. So if you think about some people have to spend hours of their day just to find some clean water every day, right? That's absurd at this stage that we don't solve for that, and instead we focus on all these other things. So the larger point here is you want to prioritize for yourself what's within your reach and how you want to spend your time, and ideally it's worthwhile goals, but I'm not the one to call them worthwhile. It's up to you. So I don't find it. I find most things not worth doing. Right?
Of course,
and that's the question you should always be asking: is it worth doing? I.e., a good question to ask yourself is: if I had a day to live, would I be doing that? And if not, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Right? That puts things into perspective. Right? It's hard to have keep perspective and have perspective. That's what I was referring to earlier. Right? So it's very important to step out and take on a global view. And I probably do this too much, to be honest, where I like disengage with things where it would be probably more valuable to engage. But in my mind, I see like the outcome of certain like technologies and so forth that I thought about and think, okay, yeah, I know where this is going. And I know this is like a lateral move rather than getting us closer where we want to be. So I'm not actually interested in these lateral moves. Right? So the one example, and that will annoy a lot of people at this point in time, is like the whole decentralized finance space. So the way these technologies work right now is very much the same the legacy systems work, in the sense of that they're extractive, right? So, and the larger point there, though, is that I think the overriding goal you want to work backwards from is: how do we de-financialize the economy? Right? So the question, the problem statement you should have is like, okay, what parts of these systems are good and necessary, and what parts are unnecessary? So if we're assigning 13.5% of GDP today to financial services, what is the right number for that? It's probably not 13%. It might not be zero, but my gut tells me it shouldn't be more than 1%, right? Because if you just simply look at all these functions, can I automate all of those functions? For the most part, I can already see that, right? So we'll have large lending pools. They're completely automated. The challenges, they're limited to digitally native assets. So you should be working on that problem, as in how can you bring real world assets into the system, attach them to the system, so that you don't need a middleman, that you don't need a commercial bank to create new money, but we can use the money that's already existing in the system, and that would sustain the economy just fine and would mitigate against the externality of inflating this particular asset class, and the secondary externality inflates broad money supply overall, right? And to me, these things are super obvious and measurable, right? You can look at that. And so work backwards from there. So rather than Uniswap and so forth building up billion-dollar treasuries and just sitting on it, is like, how do you assign those to actually eliminate the fluff that we have in the actual real-world economy right now, right? So that is a worthwhile task. Not that this intermediate state doesn't have value. As I said, it comes back to it's really a multi-massive online player game at this stage, which has a lot of value. We should have done this with fiat currencies, play games first and see how they work out, and then implement them in real-world economic activity. But I think it's very important to keep in mind where you want to be going, right? And then where we are right now. And so that's why certain discussions are simply not, for me, not interesting, because, okay, you duplicated the existing system, but you took this one element out, but it actually has no influence on meat space at this point in time. So come back when it has influence on meat space, and then I might be, then I'm definitely interested, right? But before that, I'm only so much interested in playing your particular game as long as it's extractive and resembles the legacy system. Anyway, that's just one example. There's lots of examples on a daily basis.
Yeah, of course.
And I could be totally wrong, right? So obviously, I could be entirely wrong about that. And maybe this is like the most relevant discussion to be had. But for me, it always sounds like a discussion around what colors should my bytes be. I'm not interested in the colors of my bytes. I'm interested in what velocity they have and if they actually make my life better on a daily basis. And then overall make people's lives better on a daily basis. And arguably, these systems make life better as an example, but not as as a matter of practicality. There's limited utility today, unfortunately.
Interesting. Yeah, I would at some point like to follow up on what aspects of DeFi are extractive or unnecessary. I've never really looked at that in depth necessarily, other than the credit systems. But I wanted to ask first, you've said a few things that I want to link together. We were talking earlier about how certain governments are disappearing their billionaires. And you also said that basically every government is being oppressive and tyrannical and strange in some form or another of a similar nature. Yeah. And you also said far earlier that as you get older, you're becoming more provocative. I'm wondering if there's a Venn diagram in all three of those. What's the crazy, what's the craziest thing that you're comfortable thinking could be a valid hypothesis, a working hypothesis? Are there evil men at the top, pulling strings? What's going on here?
No. So I don't subscribe to any of these conspiracy theories, mostly because they're just not practical, right? If you look at all of these, they require so much coordination and so many people in most cases, it doesn't hold up, right? So if JFK was being murdered by this conspiracy of dozens of people, one of them on their deathbed would have omitted that he or she was involved, and we would know it factually and we would have concrete evidence. But the fact that this doesn't happen or ever happen leads you to the conclusion that these are just systems of time, right? So overall, like even I used to subscribe to this whole creature from Jekyll Island idea, right? But it's very much a conspiracy. It's like it was a system that was useful at the time and solved a problem at the time that is pretty much undisputable. It just has outlived its usefulness and doesn't account for the externality it has created. That's all there is. So, and overall, and that's actually one of my larger hopes, is like governments are largely inept, right? So you see this simply in how they maintain infrastructure, and you see this in the type of people that they put in positions of being able to make decisions and so forth. So my hope and my expectation actually is that governments at large will sort of by coincidence defeat their own fiat systems because they're trying to do something better. They're being pressured by other nation states and creating digital bearer instruments, and some of them will just by accident create it in a way that leads to human flourishing and doesn't actually end up in a surveillance state. But again, it's not intentionally, it's simply inaptitude. It's simply the fact that they don't have access to the best resources. And then overall, what we're talking about is is technology, which also complies to the laws of requisite variety from evolutionary perspectives and pressures, where the most flexible within a system will eventually rule the system. And so governments are not very flexible. So that's why even like the current discussions around the regulations of crypto and so forth, yes, it's annoying that they're even discussing that. And it's like obviously misguided and is obviously not understanding these technologies and so forth. But then overall, the counterposition to that is, oh, well, we have thousands and probably more like hundreds of thousands of people that are developing these technologies, and they're more likely to come up with solutions for problems that regulation creates than the other way around, right? So that's why I'm not so worried in that regards, and that's why you can measure that, right? So the internet, I'm sure you remember that was called the information superhighway. That was Bill Gates' idea, and he actually published a book under that title that he then tried to claw back. I still have the original copy with that title, but the point there being is he thought that Microsoft should be running that information superhighway, and so every web server would be a Microsoft server, and obviously that hasn't happened, right? And if you go all the way back to why most web servers right now run, let's say, Apache, that goes back to the idea that IBM was trying to sell a web server, right? And people started patching it and creating open source library, hence the name Apache. It has nothing to do with the tribe.
That's funny.
And so, but the point there being is, so that is kind of an externality or like a observable reality of code development that actually resembles very much that of evolution. So it's the law of requisite variety in action, where the most flexible is ruling the system. So the most flexible is the Linux operating system that's ruling the internet, right? So there's very few people that run commercial web servers that they're paying for, and most people just download Apache or even just download an entire open source stack that facilitates that. So the unfortunate thing that we haven't solved for is all the other pieces, and the most important piece, I think, all the actual communication devices, the hardware at the end, right? So we need to solve for these entry points, because they have been and will, for the time being, a crucial breakpoint for humans to protect themselves against government surveillance, and they're specifically nefarious government surveillance. And that's why we should think these things through in terms of we should have more open source hardware. We should foster that, and then everything that we can, quote unquote, decentralize. I'm not such a big fan of that term. It leads to a lot of confusion. But overall, a lot of these systems should be simply accessible to everybody for free, right? So because it's information technology, it's information itself. Information should be free, has been free. We're all living on the shoulders of giants, and to bottle this up and to allow the way that like the Android system is being distributed now in this particular force-fed way, it's really a crime, right? Because Apple does an okay job protecting their individuals, but most people in the developing nations won't ever be able to afford an iPhone, and then also overall, it should be a more open, not even platform, that's the wrong term, but a more open network that's accessible to everybody. There shouldn't be any gatekeepers like Apple and so forth on there. You should have the choice. If I pay $1,000 for this device here, I should have the choice of what type of operating system I want to run, what kind of security I want to run, whether or not I want to identify myself, whether or not I'm going to have a fixed IP and so forth. Because ultimately, and I'm sure you guys read George Orwell's books, and I was just looking at a summary of that again last night. Ultimately, that has always been the entry point for fascism and human suffering and wars, to be able to control information. And so we have this duality of endpoints that are pretty trivial for governments to usurp, right? And we need to mitigate against that. So the call to action here would be to companies like Google, like Apple, to say, okay, you are the gatekeepers, the last gatekeepers once we decentralize network infrastructure that we call the World Wide Web today, the Internet today. But now you are the one that are the bottleneck, and you should start thinking about this right now, right? So when you buy your phone, you should get that option of, I want this totally decentralized. I want a number that I own that's not assigned to a nation state, which is a project we're working on right now. And there shouldn't be a way for people to track me, to identify me, and so forth, because that comes back to the earlier request. The hurdle is always, is this a technology, is this a utility that can be used by an individual in a state that is not as friendly as the one that I'm living in? And that is the worst of all states, and it should be usable by that person, because otherwise I want to see the technology that invalidates that model, both from a technology perspective and, more important, from a business model perspective, because that's your pressure angle, right? Once you invalidate the business model of selling data by making it really uncomfortable, by starting to put people in prison who do that, people will stop doing it, right? So people who do this at scale today, for me, these are criminals, right? So that to sell personal identifiable data, aggregate personal identifiable data, allow people without my consent to create profiles from that and target me, even if it's just advertising, I don't care. Unless I have actively consented to that, you're violating my rights, period, full stop, and you should suffer the consequences for that. Right? And I don't even see how anybody can dispute that. What is the argument for allowing this particular state of surveillance to be allowed? I mean, 99% and probably 100% of what you do with, let's say, your funds and whatnot doesn't deserve any scrutiny, right? So the world lives on open commercial activity that doesn't require financial surveillance. It doesn't require surveillance of who you are, what you do, and shouldn't, right? So the default should always go towards everything is private, anonymous, unobserved. And if it's being observed, you need to have a very, very good reason for that, right? So you need to show that there is harm. And if you cannot show this on the, not the sketch, or, well, we're doing KYC on everybody because there is 50 people in the world who do money laundering. However, the number really doesn't matter. But the point there being is you can't just assume that basically everybody is evil. And so it's like putting everybody by default in prison. It's like, yeah, we let you out, but you have to first prove that you're innocent. That's not how that works. And kind of that's what we're allowing to happen with the flow of information and the flow of funds today. That is utterly absurd if you think about this, that this ever happened. The state of technology is such that perfect surveillance is absolutely at reach and already true for certain government agencies right now, right? So that is extremely dangerous, extremely worrisome, has been worrying me for a decade or more, right? Not because I want to do anything nefarious, to the contrary. I want to help those people that do nefarious things, because usually nefarious things don't happen because people are born evil, right? They're doing nefarious things because they're in a certain situation where this is the only way to act to get out of this particular situation. Not break into a house and steal something because I find that exhilarating, probably most likely, but because I'm under some form of commercial pressure, right? And that is true for, I would argue, 90 or 99% of people in the world. So the answer is not surveil everybody. The answer is not to put people in prison. The answer is always educate people and provide them with the things that they need to be happy, right? And I don't see why we can't do this for every human being right now. Right? In my mind, we have the capacity, we have the resources, we have the technology to do this right now, and we had it for some time.
Yeah.
So that and so once you start thinking in these terms, then all of these nonsense discussions around, well, you need to do KYC and you need to do all these other things, they just become noise to you. You realize, okay, you're talking about something that we will solve in technology, and keep focusing on this nonsense, but you're living in the past, right? And if you want to live in the past, then you're eventually going to live in a very, very ugly future, right? Where everything resembles China, or worse, everything resembles North Korea, where everything that you read, everything that you do is surveilled and censored. And I don't think that anybody's living under those circumstances, or anybody who is actually imposing these circumstances to the population at large lives a fulfilling life, right? And that's ultimately, I guess, what people want to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Every action is based on the idea that you're going to be happy afterwards. Right? That's the only reason why people act. Right? That's ultimately the only reason.
I love it. I think that's a wonderful place to end on. I feel there's a lot of philosophical alignment in that regard, and the human flourishing is not something that is difficult to solve technologically. It's difficult to coordinate. It's difficult to get the will, the political and economic will, directed in the right places.
And partially is just long-term thinking. Right? Partially it's just, if everybody had the expectation that they would live forever and be confined to this planet, I think everybody would act very differently. Right? It's like, I have to live with the consequences of my behavior today for the rest of my life. Buffett has this metaphor: if you can only buy one car in your life, right? So how would you treat this car? Right? You would be very careful with that, but most people just don't have this very wide perspective. It's very hard to instill this. Obviously, it's something you get to over time, and I wouldn't say with age, because I don't think it's really a matter of time. It's mostly a matter of pressure and attention, right? Change doesn't take time. Change takes motivation, right? So if you're motivated enough, you change.
Yeah.
Cool. I believe that's a good place to finish up. Mike, have you got any more to say, or we've got a pretty hard stop, I believe?
Yeah, I'm good, Chris. I want to make sure we let you go on time. I'm happy to sign off here.